There is a jet that flew combat missions for 7 years before the world knew it existed. Not a prototype, not a rumor. A fully operational war machine, striking targets in the dead of night while the public had no idea it was real. When it was finally revealed in 1988, the photograph looked like something from science fiction, a black, faceted shape that seemed to defy the laws of aerodynamics. Sharp angles where curves should be, flat surfaces where wings belonged. But here is what makes the F-117 Nighthawk different from every other classified aircraft program. It did not just hide from the enemy, it was built because America was terrified. Terrified that Soviet radar technology had become so advanced that nothing could penetrate it. Terrified that the next war would be lost before a single bomb was dropped. This is the story of how paranoia became a weapon, and how that weapon changed warfare before it ever proved it could work. To understand why the F-117 exists, you need to understand 1975. The Vietnam War was over. The wreckage was still smoldering, not just in Southeast Asia, but in Pentagon conference rooms where generals stared at casualty reports and asked a question no one wanted to answer. How did we lose so many aircraft? The numbers were brutal. Over 1,000 American planes shot down, hundreds of pilots killed or captured, and the culprit was not enemy fighters. It was something far more terrifying: radar-guided surface-to-air missiles. Soviet SA-2 and SA-3 systems turned the skies over North Vietnam into a killing field. Radar locked onto American jets from miles away, tracking them with cold precision. Pilots had no warning, no chance to evade, just the sudden flash of a missile streak, and then nothing. The Air Force tried everything: electronic jamming, low-altitude bombing runs, wild weasel missions to hunt down radar sites. But for every site destroyed, 2 more appeared. The Soviets were building an invisible wall across Eastern Europe and Asia, a radar network so dense that nothing could fly through undetected, and in Moscow, they were making it better. More sensitive, more lethal, more impossible to fool. By 1975, American intelligence painted a nightmare scenario. If war broke out with the Soviet Union, NATO aircraft would not make it past the first wave of Soviet radar defenses. Thousands of lives would be lost. Strategic targets would remain untouched. Nuclear escalation would become the only option. The Pentagon needed a plane that radar could not see. Not one that was harder to detect, but one that was invisible. Physics said that was impossible. There was just one problem. Nobody knew if this could even work. Enter Ben Rich, a soft-spoken engineer with thick glasses and an obsession with the impossible. Rich worked at Lockheed Skunk Works, a legendary black projects division in Burbank, California. This was the team that built the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird, aircraft that redefined what was possible. But Rich had a problem. Stealth technology did not exist yet. Not really. There were theories, scattered research papers from obscure Soviet scientists, whispers about radar absorbing materials, but no one had built a plane that could vanish from radar screens. No one knew if it could even fly. Rich's breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a Soviet physicist named Pyotr Ufimtsev. In 1962, Ufimtsev published a paper on electromagnetic wave scattering. It was dense, mathematical, and ignored by his own government. But when American intelligence translated it years later, Rich saw something extraordinary, a formula for predicting how radar waves bounce off complex shapes. The implications were staggering. If you could predict radar reflections, you could design a shape that reflected radar away from the source, making the aircraft invisible. But there was a cost. The shape would be radical, unconventional, and possibly unflyable. Rich did not care. Rich taped Ufimtsev's equations above his desk like a creed: shape first, everything else second. He assembled a team of engineers and gave them one directive: build a plane that radar cannot see, whatever it takes. Meanwhile, in the Pentagon, a man named William Perry was watching. Perry was the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, the gatekeeper for every advanced weapons program in the American military. He had reviewed the intelligence on Soviet radar. He knew what was coming, and he knew that if stealth technology was real, it would change everything. But Perry was also a pragmatist. He had seen too many miracle weapons fail, too many billion-dollar programs that promised the moon and delivered nothing. So in 1975, Perry issued a challenge: prove stealth works. Not with simulations or models, but with a real aircraft. And you have 2 years. The competition was born: Have Blue, 2 prototype stealth demonstrators to test whether invisibility was science or fantasy. Rich's team at Skunk Works went to work. What they designed looked like nothing that had ever flown. But what happens when you make a plane the computers have to fly? The F-117's design is an argument with aerodynamics. Where aircraft love curves, the Nighthawk answers with planes and edges. Each facet is placed to throw radar energy anywhere but home. Look at any conventional aircraft. They have smooth curves, rounded edges, and wings that taper gracefully. That is aerodynamic efficiency. That is how you generate lift, minimize drag, and create stability. The F-117 rejects all of that. It is a collection of flat panels arranged at sharp angles, like a geometric nightmare sketched by someone who hated curves. Every surface is precisely angled to deflect radar waves away from the transmitter. Not absorb them, but redirect them. Here is why that matters. Radar works by sending out electromagnetic waves and listening for reflections. When a wave hits a round surface, like a traditional aircraft, it bounces back toward the source like a mirror. The radar operator sees a bright return signal. Target acquired. But if the surface is flat and angled just right, the wave bounces away at a predictable angle. It goes into space, into the ground, anywhere but back to the radar. The operator sees nothing. Just empty sky. The F-117's engineers used Ufimtsev's equations to calculate exactly how every panel, every edge, and every angle would interact with radar waves. They modeled thousands of configurations. They tested radar cross-sections smaller than a bird. The result was a shape so stealthy that at certain aspects, its radar return shrank to marble small. It became noise a storm cell could swallow. If radar is the eye, the F-117 taught engineers how to blind it, but making a flying stealth platform introduced problems no one had solved. First, stability. The F-117's faceted design made it aerodynamically unstable. It was constantly trying to flip, roll, or tumble out of control. No human pilot could fly it manually. One test pilot said the jet felt like balancing a pencil on your fingertip for hours. The solution was fly-by-wire. Computers adjusted control surfaces hundreds of times per second, keeping the jet stable without pilot input. It was the first production fighter to be completely computer-dependent. If the flight control system failed, the aircraft would become unflyable in seconds. Next, engines. Jet engines are radar magnets. Spinning turbine blades create massive radar returns. The F-117 solved this by burying the engines deep inside the fuselage and covering the intakes with a fine mesh screen. Radar waves could not penetrate, but airflow was restricted. The engines ran hotter and less efficiently. Performance suffered. The F-117 used two non-afterburning F-404 variants, around 10 to 11,000 pounds of thrust each. This was fine for high subsonic dash, but nowhere near a fighter's thrust to weight. There were no afterburners and no supersonic capability. Top speed was high subsonic without afterburner, well below classic fighters and slower than a Vietnam-era F-4 Phantom. Third, weapons could not have external hardpoints on a stealth jet. Missiles and bombs hanging off the wings would light up radar like Christmas trees. Everything had to be internal. The F-117's weapons bay could hold exactly 2 laser-guided bombs. 2. That was it. Compare that to an F-16, which could carry 6 tons of ordnance on external pylons. The F-117 traded firepower for invisibility. Then there was the cockpit. The faceted canopy left pilots with limited forward and side visibility. This was bad enough that many joked they were flying a black cockroach. Night missions only. There was no radar of their own because radar emissions would give away their position. Navigation was done with infrared sensors and inertial guidance. The F-117 was not a fighter. It was not a dogfighter. It was not even particularly fast. It was an assassin's toolkit. Slow, methodical, invisible. It was built to strike and vanish before anyone knew it was there. But first, it had to prove it could fly. The first Have-Blue prototype lifted off from Groom Lake, Area 51, in December 1977. Test pilot Bill Park sat in the cramped cockpit, surrounded by faceted panels and minimal instrumentation. The controls felt wrong. The jet wanted to roll. The computers screamed, correcting constantly. But when Park turned on the radar cross-section measurement equipment and flew past the tracking stations, something extraordinary happened. As Park passed the range radar, the scope did not dim, it went empty. A jet in daylight had become background noise. The engineers watching from the ground stood in silence. Then someone whispered, "It works." Stealth worked, but could it survive real war? The celebration was short-lived. Have-Blue was a fragile, temperamental machine. The fly-by-wire system was prone to glitches. The landing gear was weak. On the aircraft's 5th flight, a hydraulic failure caused a hard landing that destroyed the prototype. Park ejected safely. The wreckage was buried in the desert. The second Have Blue fared worse. In July 1979, pilot Ken Dyson was on a routine test flight when the flight control system failed. The jet pitched nose down and entered an uncontrollable dive. Dyson ejected at the last second. The prototype disintegrated on impact. 2 prototypes were destroyed. Millions of dollars were incinerated. But the radar test data was undeniable. Stealth worked. The Pentagon wanted more. In 1978, while Have Blue was still flying, Lockheed was awarded a contract to build a full-scale operational stealth fighter, the F-117A. 59 aircraft were developed in secret. There was no public acknowledgement. The program was codenamed Senior Trend. It operated under security protocols that bordered on paranoia. Workers at the Skunk works were not told what they were building. Components were manufactured separately. Engineers worked in isolated teams. Even inside Lockheed, only a handful of people understood the full design. Pilots selected for the program were pulled from active duty with no explanation. They were told to report to Tonopah Test Range, a remote airbase in the Nevada desert, 140 miles northwest of Las Vegas. There were no visitors, no phone calls, and no acknowledgement that the base existed. Families were told their husbands and fathers were on temporary assignment. Some marriages did not survive the secrecy. The first production, F-117A, rolled out in June 1980. 1. It looked like the Have Blue prototypes, but larger, heavier, and more refined. The faceted surfaces were sharper. The weapons bay was operational. The flight computers were more reliable. But it was still a nightmare to fly. Colonel Al Whitley was one of the first operational F-117 pilots. He described the experience as fighting the jet every second. The fly-by-wire system made the aircraft controllable, but only just. Any malfunction, any computer glitch, and you had seconds to eject before the jet entered a death spiral. Training missions were flown exclusively at night. Pilots wore night vision goggles and navigated using infrared sensors. There were no lights, no radio chatter, and no external communication. If you saw an F-117 in the night sky, it was by accident, and you would not see it for long. The Nighthawk's operational profile was unlike anything in aviation history. Missions were planned down to the second. Routes were calculated to avoid radar coverage. Timing was synchronized with satellite passes. The jet would take off, fly 600 miles into hostile territory, drop 2 bombs on a target with pinpoint accuracy, and return, all without anyone knowing it was there. But there was a dark side to this obsessive secrecy. In the early 1,980 seconds, multiple training losses occurred. Pilots died. The outside world heard classified training accident and nothing more. The crashes were investigated internally. Wreckage was recovered under armed guard and destroyed. The world had no idea the F-117 existed, and the Air Force intended to keep it that way. But paranoia has a cost. By 1988, the program was bleeding money. Each F-117 cost $122 million adjusted for inflation. That's over $300 million today. For a jet that had never been used in combat, for a jet that kept crashing, for a jet the public didn't know existed, Congress was getting suspicious. Budget allocations for classified aviation programs had ballooned. Senators demanded answers. The Air Force stonewalled, and then someone leaked a photograph. In November 1988, the Pentagon released a single grainy image, a dark, angular shape parked on a runway. No context, no explanation, just proof that something existed. The media exploded. Aviation analysts scrambled to explain the bizarre shape. Conspiracy theorists had a field day, and the Air Force was forced to admit the truth. Yes, we built a stealth fighter. Yes, it's been operational for 7 years. No, we won't tell you anything else. The public reveal was carefully managed. Limited information, no flight demonstrations. No technical specifications, just enough to kill the rumors, not enough to compromise the program. But the world was watching, and the Nighthawk's first real test was coming. Panama answered the wrong question. December 1989. Panama. Operation Just Cause the U.S. invasion to remove dictator Manuel Noriega. A relatively small conflict. Limited objectives. But the Pentagon saw an opportunity. The F-117's combat debut. 2 Nighthawks were tasked with a single mission: strike the Rio Hato military barracks and knock out Panamanian Defense Force command and control. The goal was psychological: show overwhelming force, induce, surrender, minimize casualties. At 1 a.m., the phone 117 seconds crossed into Panamanian airspace, invisible to radar, silent. The pilots guided their jets using infrared targeting pods, watching the barracks through green-tinted screens. The first bomb impacted short to shock and disorient. The second failed to neutralize the barracks. Ground forces still had to clear it, a messy debut. Inside Tonopah, the mood wasn't triumph, it was doubt. Post-mission analysis revealed the problem: pilot error, combined with unfamiliar targeting systems and rushed planning. The F-117 could deliver a bomb with surgical precision, but only if the pilot executed perfectly. There was no margin for error, no backup, no second chances. The Air Force buried the Panama results. Officially, the mission was a success. Internally, doubts spread. Asterisk. Was the near miss a smart stun tactic or a failure? How would you have planned that strike? Asterisk. But then came the 17th of January, 1991, the Gulf War. Iraq had the 6th largest military in the world. A dense, integrated air defense network, Soviet-supplied radar systems, hundreds of surface-to-air missile batteries, advanced fighters. Intelligence estimates predicted catastrophic losses if the US attempted a conventional bombing campaign. Coalition commanders had a single question: can the F-117 survive? The answer came on the first night. 42 F-117 Nighthawks launched from Saudi Arabia and flew deep into Iraqi airspace through the heart of Baghdad's air defenses. Their targets: command bunkers, communication centers, radar installations, the most heavily defended sites in the country. Ear footage of Baghdad AAA traces against empty sky. Lower NAT sound, VO over. Iraqi radar operators saw nothing. No warning, no detection, just sudden explosions as laser-guided bombs obliterated targets with terrifying precision. CNN broadcast live from Baghdad. Reporters described anti-aircraft fire lighting up the sky tracers, shooting at nothing. No aircraft visible, no sound, just the green flashes of bombs hitting their marks. Baghdad lit the sky with tracers at ghosts. Over 1,200 Nighthawk sorties, 1,600 targets struck, 0 combat losses. Iraq's operators later said, "We didn't fail. We never saw them." Compare that to conventional aircraft. F, 16 seconds. F divided by A, 18 seconds. 18 seconds, dozens took battle damage. Some were shot down. Pilots were killed or captured. The F-117 proved something no one had fully believed. Invisibility was real, and it was unstoppable. Stealth didn't just win missions, it moved the